Is Northwestern offensive lineman Peter Skoronski the right guy to replace Kaleb McGary for the Falcons? Guys, it's Mock Draft Monday. Let's get it.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. Sirius Black, and, of course, the most humble host that has ever existed here of this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by Ultimate Football GM. If you've ever dreamed of becoming an NFL GM and managing your own football franchise, then this is the game definitely for you. Download the game. All you got to do is visit ultimate-gm.com or look it up in the app stores. Our listeners get a 100% free boost to their franchise when they use the promo code Locked On in all caps in the game store. So, guys, I want to thank you as well for making Locked On Falcons your first listen each and every day. It's, of course, free and available Monday through Friday on a variety of podcast platforms, including on YouTube, where if you subscribe to us on YouTube, you can get the podcast the night before the audio drops. And of course, you can also check us out on your under Locked On Sports Atlanta on your Roku and Amazon Fire TV. Just download the Locked On Sports Atlanta app and you can check us out on your Roku and Amazon Fire TV. So, of course, with that being said, it is Mock Draft Monday here, where we look back over a mock draft, prominent mock draft over the last week and break down who they have selecting for the Atlanta Falcons and take a deep dive into that player. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about Peter Skoronski, who Todd McShay, of course, of ESPN, mocked to the Falcons at the 8th overall selection. And I think when you think about Skoronski's fit with the Ravens, it makes a ton of sense because they have Ben Powers, their starting left guard, coming off a good season. He's going to hit free agency. Skoronski has potentially the versatility to kick inside there. They also have some major question marks on the right side of their offensive line with Kevin Zeitler. I think he's going to be 33, their right guard. Right tackle Morgan Moses is going to be 32 this year. So they need to get younger at that position. You can have Skoronski playing either one of those two spots. And stabilizing the offensive line position for the Ravens makes a ton of sense, given that there are some question marks about the future of that quarterback position and whether it's Lamar Jackson or some other guy stepping in for Lamar Jackson this year. Like, it makes a ton of sense for the Ravens. Sorry, guys, the Ravens. Why am I talking about how Skoronski fits with the Baltimore Ravens? It's not as if the Ravens are going to have the 8th overall selection. So that's my bad. That's my bad, guys. I owe you one on that one. Let's talk about Peter Skoronski's fit with the Falcons. That's who's going to have the 8th overall draft selection, not the Ravens. There's no world where the Ravens have the 8th overall draft selection. So let's talk about Peter Skoronski's fit with the Falcons. My bad, guys. My mistake. Simple. Just, we'll get it right this week. I've been out of practice for too long this weekend. The 2 days off just really addled my brain. But let's talk about Skoronski's fit with the Falcons, and let's look at Todd McShay's blurb that he wrote about this draft selection. And he writes, Atlanta has Kaleb McGary and Chuma Edoga headed to free agency, meaning the offensive tackle depth is barren. And for a team that relies so heavily on the run, the line has to be a focus. Questions about Skoronski's length should get answers at the combine in a few weeks. But man, this guy's quickness, balance, and awareness are outstanding. He takes great angles as a run blocker, which should open up things for Tyler Algier and whoever else is taking handoffs next season. He also writes about the Falcons potentially looking at a quarterback. Quarterback is worth a look. But with Desmond Ridder in the fold, I'm not sure the Falcons take the plunge on Florida's Anthony Richardson here with the top 3 signal callers off the board. If Atlanta doesn't stick with Ridder, it probably wouldn't turn to another developmental quarterback like Richardson. He does wind up having Richardson go to the Carolina Panthers at the 9th overall selection. But I think McShay hits it right on the mark that the world where the Falcons target a player like Peter Skoronski is one where they're looking to replace Kaleb McGary, who is an impending free agent. And right now it's about iffy, 50-50 maybe, depending on who you ask, on whether Kaleb McGary is going to be back in Atlanta. Like, I've been making the assumption that McGary will be back because the Falcons ran it back with the starting five last year. And given that the offensive line played so well this year, why wouldn't they run it back with the same starting five, including, Elijah Wilkinson, the starting left guard, who's an impending free agent, along with Kaleb McGary, the right tackle. But part of me also wonders, did the Falcons run it back last year not by choice, but due to they were compelled to do so because they didn't have the money to go out there and upgrade the offensive line? And now that this offseason they have the money to potentially go out there and spend and get the offensive lineman of their choice, would they be as willing to run it back with those guys? But the interesting thing, like, it's pressers, and so you don't want to necessarily read too much into what Terry Fontenot and Arthur Smith said. But it was just funny to listen to that year-end presser that Terry and Arthur did a couple of weeks ago back in January, and they were asked about, like, sort of what Kaleb McGary's status is and do they want him back, and Terry put on his, like, little 60s Batman supervillain costume and was like, like, we're not going to negotiate in front of the media, but we like Kaleb, but we're not going to talk about it. Like, I love how Terry does that. Like, he's like a supervillain on a cheesy TV show where he's just like, we're not going to negotiate in front of the media, but we like what Kaleb McGary is, but you'll never find out if we're going to re-sign him. Ooh. And so that is basically, Terry doing his alter ego. I guess we'll call him Terrible Terry in terms of what he says at these pressers. But I just found that funny. Obviously, in a world where Kaleb McGary does not resign and Terry does his thing and goes out there and they're looking to replace him, that's going to open up a glaring hole at right tackle. And then we'll continue today's episode talking about whether or not Skoronski, and talk about him as the player and whether or not he can fill those shoes in terms of Kaleb McGary, and some of my concerns about Peter Skoronski and his potential fit here in Atlanta. And we'll get into that as we continue today's episode. But I want to tell you today, guys, this episode is brought to you by the Ultimate Football GM. You've heard me talk about this fun new mobile game. And if you've ever dreamed of becoming an NFL GM, managing your own franchise, hiring, firing coaches and coordinators, making trades, navigating your football team through free agency and the draft and through all the ups and downs of a regular season, then this is, your dream come true. And this is definitely the game for you. Talked about before where with the Locked On listeners in the Discord talking about how much fun they've been having with the game. And I think you guys will also enjoy the game. What I love about this game is, you can play it completely offline. So you can be completely addicted to it for like a weekend, and then you can put it down for a week and not feel like you're going to miss anything. And so I think this is a great opportunity for you guys to get involved because we are starting up our very own Locked On League, and you can compete with all the other Locked On listeners from around the world. So just choose Locked On League in the app to join. And you will also get a free 100% boost when you use that promo code Locked On in all caps, LOCKEDON, in all caps in the game store. So check it out today. So if you want to download the game, all you got to do is visit ultimate-gm.com, or you can look it up in the app stores. That's ultimate-gm.com. Ultimate Football GM. Start your dynasty today. So let's talk about Peter Skoronski and going back over his background. He was a highly recruited player, I think in the Illinois area, 4-star recruit, according to various publications, was mentioned as a center in some of these recruiting rankings. But from what I've read, only played about 4 out of the 5 positions, not including center. That was the one position he did not play, or at least dabble at in high school. And to me, this is interesting because this sort of came up where, like, you'll see some blurbs on Peter Skoronski where he was like, the number 1 ranked center or whatever in his various region or whatever. And it's similar to where you heard with Penny Sewell a couple of years ago, where he was like, oh, this highly recruited guard when he went to Oregon as a recruiting rankings. And all the information I could ever find on Penny Sewell showed me that he never played guard in high school. And as I indicated, like, Skoronski never played center in high school. So I would, for future reference, guys, having learned this a couple of times, when you see these high school rankings, like, oh, he was the number 1 rated center, don't take those for granted, right? Do the research to find out if the player actually played that, because some of these recruiting rankings just kind of project guys, because I guess someone around the world thinks like, oh, he'll make a good center, even if he's never played center. But obviously Skoronski goes on to play left tackle for 3 years as a starter at Northwestern. He fills in for Rashawn Slater beginning as a true freshman back in 2020 when Slater sat out that year due to COVID, and then ultimately went on to the NFL. And Skoronski filled in, very well as a true freshman, was graded out very highly. I think he was like PFF's highest graded offensive tackle or second highest graded offensive tackle this past year. So he's been a player that came in right away and was very successful. And I think a lot of people look at that and say that's probably going to be a guy that's going to come into the NFL and be very successful. And it makes sense because a lot of his success is technical, right? He's cool, calm, collected from a technical standpoint, very solid there. And that's something that you like to see with guys, polished there coming out of college. My concerns with Skoronski, though, are related to, I don't know if he's a great athlete. And for me, that matters a little bit more, typically with a technician guy, like, you're not too concerned about how athletic is he, but it does matter a little bit more to me with Skoronski, just because like the other question mark I have about him, like I would feel a lot better, him having, this other flaw, which is related to his arm length question marks, if he was a high end athlete. And that arm length, the reports, and we'll find out what the combine says in a week or two, in terms of what he measures in, but the various reports are that he's going to have sub 33-inch arms. And that seems arbitrary, which it is to a certain extent, but there isn't a rich history of sub 33-inch arm tackles succeeding in NFL. Like when you go to like websites like Mock Draftable, who have arm length for like the last 10, 15 years of draft prospects, like you're looking at basically, at least over the last decade or so, you're looking at like Braden Smith, the Colts right tackle, and to a lesser extent, Kaleb McGary, who also had sub 33-inch arms. But when you look at the history of offensive tackle that had quote unquote short arms, very few of them, like Matt Light is a player, former Patriots left tackle, is mentioned, but I think he had like 33.5-inch arms. Rashawn Slater came in, had the similar question marks, but came in at 33 even. And it does seem like that is kind of the cutoff for success, which seems arbitrary. Like, why would someone with 33-inch arms and someone with 32 and 5/8-inch arms, does that really matter? And oftentimes it doesn't, but to me, when I watch Skoronski on film, it does seem to show up from time to time. And I think part of the reason why it wasn't consistently an issue for him at Northwestern, just because like the caliber of pass rusher that he was facing in the Big Ten was not, the same as it would be in other conferences in recent years. And so that is a concern. And because of those arm length concerns, there's a lot of people that think, Skoronski would be better playing inside as a guard or even a center, right? Where, as a tackle, you do worry about arm length because you're going to face pass rushers typically at D end. They're like 6'5" with like, 7-foot wingspans and whatnot. And so those guys can get into your body much quicker and really hurt you from an arm length standpoint. And we've seen that, a number of times with a guy like Kaleb McGary, who cannot be as aggressive, with his punches, because of he's going to get, locked out with someone against arm length. And so the player that, Skoronski kind of reminded me of more so than, the high end player was like Liam Eichenberg, who also had sub 33-inch arms, who was drafted by the Dolphins a couple of years ago in the second round. I personally thought Eichenberg was probably a little bit better of an athlete. He just seemed a little bit smoother on film at Notre Dame than Skoronski does at Northwestern. And Eichenberg has kind of struggled because initially he was projected to be a guard in the NFL due to those arm length concerns, but started out kind of playing both left and right tackle and seemed okay at that spot. And I know Miami moved him to guard this past year, and from what I've heard, he really struggled there. And that's part of the musical chairs situation that has led to some instability for not only the Dolphins line, but Eichenberg personally. And I do wonder, for the team that drafts Skoronski, like if they don't have a clear-cut plan of like, okay, we're going to play you at this position, whether that's tackle, guard, or center, if you decide to like, oh, we'll plug and play you at a bunch of spots, we'll figure it out. I don't know if that's a great situation for him. And part of my concern with Skoronski, and I know I'm doing a lot of negatives on Skoronski. I think he's a good player. I just don't think he's like a superstar. Like it feels like to me, like he gets a little bit overrated because of like Rashawn Slater's success in the NFL, who had, again, similar question marks in terms of arm length. And it's kind of like the opposite of the helmet scouting we talked about last week when we talked about Myles Murphy, where Clemson edge rushers, given their lack of success in the NFL, is it fair to ding Myles Murphy for that? And I feel like Skoronski's getting somewhat a boost because Rashawn Slater was so successful, but at least to my eye, like I thought Slater was just pound for pound a better prospect than Skoronski. And so for me with Skoronski, the combine's going to really matter for me, at least in my personal evaluation, because I do want to see how athletic he is. Like, I think he's a good athlete. Like, I think he's like a 65th percentile athlete, or so to speak. But for me, like, I would feel a lot better about him if he's like a 75th or 80th or 90th percentile athlete in the same way as like a Rashawn Slater, who was like a 90th percentile in like all the athletic measurements. Chris Lindstrom, who was like 75th or 80th or 90th in like all his athletic measurables. Like, if Skoronski comes in below that, like, again, first round talent, but to me more of a mid to late first round talent than a guy that is necessarily deserving of being a top 10 draft pick. So in terms of his fit in Atlanta, obviously the scenario that we're easily imagining, playing him right tackle, again, you got to feel good about, is he going to be the next Braden Smith, or is he going to be the next, probably Kaleb McGary is not a good comp, but that type of player that may struggle. Eichenberg is another example. And so that's going to be a question mark for him at right tackle. But there is a scenario not only where the Falcons target a player like Skoronski, to replace Kaleb McGary, it's a scenario where they keep Kaleb McGary and they say, okay, well, we really like Skoronski as a guard, right? We really think he's going to be like a Brandon Scherf, who was a collegiate tackle that kicked inside to guard and was a top 10 pick. Again, I don't see that type of player with Skoronski, but that could change if he tests well. And so there's a scenario where you could see Peter Skoronski playing left guard for the Falcons, or even center. Even though he hasn't played that position, there is a history of college tackles converting to center in the NFL, particularly those guys that may not have the ideal size and length that they would want playing tackle. And there's a long history of those guys succeeding at the professional level. And maybe that makes sense for Skoronski, given, some question marks about Drew Dahlman and whether or not he's a fit. But more than likely, I think Skoronski would play left guard or right tackle for the Falcons. And I think given his technical prowess, I would feel probably a little bit better about him making that transition to a new position after spending the last 3 years playing left tackle than probably a lot of other guys, just because if you win by technique, primarily, that's usually a good sign that you'll figure it out at a new position. Even if you may struggle in that first year, you'll figure out the technical aspects of playing that new position for you in the future. So I do like Skoronski's versatility, but I kind of question the arm length and the athleticism, and certainly, how he fares at the combine, I think will go a long way to basically me buying more stock on a player like Peter Skoronski as a potential Falcons option. Personally, I like other tackles better in this draft class that to me are more like pure tackles. And that's like guys like Georgia's Broderick Jones or Ohio State's Paris Johnson. Those to me would be guys higher on my personal rankings than Peter Skoronski. But, that could change in like 2 weeks after the combine. So we'll see how that goes. And the rest of today's episode will be a Monday mailbag, where we'll be answering a listener question about, CJ Gardner-Johnson's potential as a Falcons free agent target. We'll talk about whether or not, Ryan Nielsen's presence is going to lead to an increase in penalties, given he's coming from New Orleans, a team that was a lot less disciplined than the Falcons this past year. So we'll get into all of those questions to wrap up today's episode. But first, I do want to plug the Locked On NFL Draft podcast. If you guys haven't checked it out over the last week or so, with new hosts Damian Parsons and Keith Sanchez, two guys that cover the NFL draft at the Draft Network, where I know you guys are constantly going. It's one of my go-to places for draft content. And so if you have been going there over the last couple of years, the type of work that Keith and Damian do in their written content and evaluations. And now they're bringing that to you, a daily podcast here on the Locked On Podcast Network. So make sure you subscribe to Locked On NFL Draft wherever you get your podcasts. So let's wrap up today's episode looking at a couple of listener questions. And first, we got one from AC94 at AchoPra94 on Twitter. He asked, "Hey, Aaron, question for you. Do you think CJ Gardner-Johnson would be a good target in free agency for the Falcons, given the NOLA ties? Or do you think it would be better to try and retain Isaiah Oliver, given how much cheaper he would be and a nickel not being a premium position? Also, side fun question. As a Canadian, I would like to know the extent of your Atlanta Thrashers knowledge. Could you name 3 former players?" Well, to answer your side question, I have zero knowledge of the Atlanta Thrashers. Couldn't name a player, couldn't name when they left Atlanta. I know they existed. That's about it. So sorry, don't know any of that information. As for CJ Gardner-Johnson, aka CJGJ, aka Chauncey Gardner-Johnson, he would be an interesting fit here because he did play in this Saint scheme that we're imagining, this Dennis Allen scheme, had a lot of success there, that we're imagining Ryan Nielsen's going to try to port over here to Atlanta. But he was primarily a nickel cornerback, as you noted. And what's notable, he got traded to Philadelphia at the beginning of the season. They moved him more to a true safety role, although towards the end of the season, he did get some snaps playing more as a nickel due to some injuries. And he was generally good this year. I think he was at a certain point, if he didn't finish leading the NFL in interceptions, he was at some point leading the NFL in interceptions. I went back and watched some film of his early in the season when he was playing primarily as a safety, given, I'm well versed in what he brings to the table as a nickel cornerback from his time in New Orleans. And I watched like a Jaguars game where he missed a couple of tackles early in the game. I watched a Cowboys game where he got 2 picks against Cooper Rush early in the season, just to kind of see the good and the bad with him. And like, what's interesting, as you say, like, to me, CJGJ kind of like the player, like it would be tough for me to imagine a scenario where him and both Isaiah Oliver get maximized in the scheme. So I think you're onto something where like it wouldn't feel right to bring in both of those guys, given like I think what CJGJ does best is be that sort of versatile safety that can also play nickel, while Isaiah Oliver does his best work playing nickel, but could dabble as a safety. So they're kind of similar. And I think you're right. Oliver is probably going to be half the cost, let's say, 8 million versus 15 million in terms of the price tag that you would have to pay, is what I'm assuming. We'll see if that's accurate. But what's interesting about CJGJ is, like, to me, he's kind of the player already that you think you want Richie Grant to be. Probably with Richie Grant being maybe a little bit less on the nickel corner stuff and more on the safety stuff, but similarly undersized guy, but is comfortable playing close to the line of scrimmage, is a playmaker, can be opportunistic, but also cover, tight ends and slot receivers as a corner. And that's something that the Falcons have asked Richie Grant to do a number of times over the past 2 seasons. So it does feel like, Richie Grant's already kind of a poor man's CJGJ. And so I think the combination of Oliver and Grant kind of give you all the things that CJGJ is going to bring to the table for the Falcons defense. So for me, at least, it doesn't make a ton of sense to go out there and spend that money unless you're just really insistent on, we want to embody all of that in one player. And then you couple that with, from a personality standpoint, and I'm sure you Falcon fans are also very familiar, given the amount of trash talk that CJGJ and how many wide receivers have swung on him over the years. From a personality standpoint, let's just say he's a lot, right? Like, he's a lot in terms of a personality, and that may not mesh with everybody's locker room. And I'm sure there are plenty of people that would say, like, the Falcons need that type of energy in their locker room. And I wouldn't necessarily disagree with that, but it is something that, like, you have to sort of factor in that, like, he's not going to fit everybody given, his personality type. So he would be an interesting signing. I do not suspect that the Falcons will be that interested in him. And I'm not even convinced that he'll be that interested in the Falcons because, like, I know some of the things that he was talking about with Philadelphia was, like, his perception was like he was brought to Philadelphia to help them win a Super Bowl. And so it does seem like that's kind of his mindset of, like, I'm one of the best players in the league. I'm here to win championship, that type of player. And so I don't know if the Falcons are going to fit that paradigm unless, they make a certain trade, in that sense. So I do wonder about the fit there, but certainly he's a good player, would be a welcome addition to Atlanta. But I kind of feel like you're getting, 75% of what he brings to the table in a world where Isaiah Oliver and Richie Grant are already on the team, and you're probably doing it for like half the price that you would have to pay for him. So I hope that answers your question, AC. We'll move on to Marcilio Laite's question at Marcilio on Twitter. He says, it looks like the Falcons were a team with a low number of penalties last season. The Saints defense looks to have committed more penalties. What do you think about it with the former Saints defensive coordinator, and Marcelo hails from Brazil. So shout out to the Brazilian Falcon fans and all of our international listeners. I know you make up a relatively small percentage, but I do appreciate you guys for tuning in and sending in questions. So to get to your point, Marcelo, the Falcons were the least penalized team in the NFL last year, and the Saints, depending on what metric you look at, like accepted penalties or total penalties or whatever, they were somewhere between like 17th and 21st from what I could find. I wouldn't worry too much about this, right? Like I do think probably it's a safe assumption to say like the penalty issues is probably more a reflection of the head coach and the defensive coordinator. And so you look at the Saints the previous couple of years before Dennis Allen took over, they were one of the least penalized teams in the NFL. And obviously that was not the case this past year. And then you look at Dennis Allen's stint with the Raiders and, roughly a decade ago, and they were one of the more penalized teams in the league that year. So I wouldn't necessarily say the Saints penalties was a reflection of Ryan Nielsen, probably more a reflection of Dennis Allen. And thus the Falcons lack of penalties is probably more a reflection of Arthur Smith than it is, any sort of assistant coach. So I wouldn't feel like that's going to be a major obstacle to overcome. So our last question comes from Derek M, and he sent an email to lockedonfalcons@mail.com, and he says, "What's up, Aaron? Question about the salary cap. So my friend claims an owner can pay a player out of pocket and it won't count towards the salary cap. I've searched to find something confirming or denying this, but I can't find anything. Do you know anything about this? Thanks for producing great content. Keep up the great work. And I also think we're way overdue for a good rant." And that comes from Derek M. So I would like to know what your friend is talking about, but I do think, yes, you can skirt the salary cap by playing a player out of pocket because that is illegal, right? So I think your friend is correct, right? That an owner can go around the salary cap by basically, if he's willing to go to jail for paying a player out of pocket and is willing to, I guess that's like tax evasion or tax fraud. I'm sure someone is a little bit more knowledgeable on the specific issue, but you're that's illegal in the United States as far as I'm concerned. So yes, if you're willing to go to jail, you can skirt the salary cap. So I think your friend is correct. But if he's referring to something else beyond just basically breaking the law, I'm not sure what he's referring to. So I think that's probably why you're having a hard time finding it, because it's just assumed that, yeah, like you can get around this. Like, I don't think anybody's doing the salary cap 101 breakdown of being like, hey, don't break the law. So I hope that answers your question there, Derek. And as far as a rant goes, yeah, we'll probably get one at some point in the next month or two. Usually they stem from you guys submitting some questions that, like, I've been keeping something bottled up inside for months and months and months, and for some reason I'm like, you triggered me and I gotta rant about it. And given the sheer number of mailbags that we do in the off season, there's a good chance that we'll get a rant at some point in the next couple of weeks. So that's probably a good bet to have. But we will not get that rant on today's episode, and that is going to do it for us here, guys. I really appreciate you guys submitting your questions. Of course, if you want to submit your questions for future mailbags, you want to see if you can be the person that triggers that future rant, of course, you can do so via Twitter or Facebook at Locked On Falcons. You can send an email like Derek did to lockedonfalcons@mail.com. You can hit me up in the Discord, the Locked On Falcons Discord, link in the description below. And of course, you can leave a comment here on the Locked On Falcons YouTube channel. Tomorrow's episode, we will be joined by a guest, Daniel Flick, who covers the Falcons over at Falcons Nation or Fan Nation for Sports Illustrated. And we'll get his thoughts on, he was at the Shrine Bowl. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. I know it's like a month later, but we'll get some of that, and as well as his viewpoint on the Falcons offseason and maybe some combine talk, given that is starting up next week. So that is the plan for tomorrow's episode, guys. Really appreciate you tuning in. Make sure you check out Locked On NFL Draft, Locked On NFL, Locked On Sports Atlanta, Locked On Hawks, Locked On Braves, Locked On Bulldogs, all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.